Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part D. The Untold Stories of the Kingdom of Israel. Chapter 3. The Untold Story in the book of Samuel about why Saul went to war against Nahash the Ammonite and consolidated his kingdom. In this chapter, I argue that the main reason why the people sought to appoint Saul as a king over Israel was omitted from the biblical description in the book of Samuel. But the short text that was omitted was preserved in a scroll discovered in a cave in Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. To substantiate this claim, I will give a brief introduction to the content of the book of Samuel and to the processes of its composition and editing, and then I will focus on the description about the anointing of Saul in 1 Samuel 8 to 12, and on the verses that were omitted from the biblical text. This is a very different example to the untold history of the kingdom of Israel, since in this chapter we will not deal only with what the biblical historiographers knew and told or didn't tell, but rather with the further incarnations of the biblical text and the circumstances of its replication over hundreds of years and the omissions and changes that occurred in the text. Such changes include intentional and unintentional disruptions, and they affected the way we read and understand the description to this day. The first and second books of Samuel were originally one book named after Samuel, the main protagonist of its first part. Samuel also influenced the second part since he is the one who anointed the two kings described there, Saul and David. The division of the book into two equal parts was made only with the appearance of printed Bibles at the end of the 15th century CE, but it makes a lot of historical and literary sense since it separates the end of Saul's reign from the beginning of David's reign. This division exists in the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, in which the books of Samuel and Kings are one book divided into 4 parts, which coincide with the later division in the Hebrew manuscripts into 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. There are 5 parts to the book of Samuel, 2 of which make up 1st Samuel. One telling of the period before the kingship, including the stories of the fall of the house of Eli and the rise of Samuel, of the wandering of the ark, and of Saul's ascension to the throne. And the other is about the period after Saul's ascension to the throne. In accordance with the Deuteronomistic tradition, a speech separates these 2 parts, Samuel's speech in chapter 12. 3 parts make 2 Samuel. The first describes David's ascension to the kingship and his consolidation of power. These are in chapter 1 to 6. And the second includes stories about the lives of David and his children, and this is in chapters 8 to 20. Here too, the 2 parts are separated by a speech with the Deuteronomistic characteristics, the speech of Nathan the prophet in chapter 7. The third and final part of the book, in chapters 21 to 24, includes an appendix with short stories, lists, and poetry. Who wrote the book of Samuel? In 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 29, it is written that, "Now the acts of King David, from first to last, are written in Chronicles of Samuel the seer, and in Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the Chronicles of Gad the seer. End of quote. This is the basis of the words of the Braita in Bava Batra 14b, and I'm quoting, Samuel wrote his own book, the book of Judges and the book of Ruth. End of quote. Since Samuel is described as having passed away as early as 1 Samuel, the Gemara continues in Bava Batra 15a and states, I'm quoting, God the seer and Nathan the prophet finished it. End of quote. Contrary to this view, the text in the book of Samuel indicates a great distance between the times of the events' occurrence and of their writing. And so, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 9, an explanatory note was added to the story of Saul looking for the asses. I'm quoting, formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he said, come, let us go to the seer, for he who is now called a prophet was formerly called a seer. End of quote. 1 Samuel 27 verse 6 states about David, and I'm quoting, so that day Achish gave him Ziklag, end of quote. And an explanatory note is added, I'm quoting, therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day, end of quote. 2 Samuel 16 verse 23 explains about the counsel of Ahithophel, I'm quoting, now in those days the counsel which Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the oracle of God. But in contrast of the tombstone that Absalom set up in the, it is said in second book of Samuel chapter 18 verse 18 that he called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. End of quote. Clearly, the book was edited much after the event took place, and as we shall see below, the hand of the Deuteronomistic editing in Samuel is less prominent than in the books of Joshua, Judges, and Kings, and clear evidence of later editing processes exists. However, it is also clear that the book of Samuel includes materials that are much older than the days of the Deuteronomistic editor, towards the end of the First Temple period, and we can even define several stages in the development of the text, some pre-Deuteronomistic and other post-Deuteronomistic, and different layers of editing which shaped the book's development over a long period of time. The editorial framework of the book includes two of the best examples to the biblical poetry. The book of Samuel opens with the song of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2 verses 1 to 10, and it ends with David's song of praise in 2 Samuel chapter 22. These two poetries are similar in form, language, and content, and the relationship between them shapes the framework of the book. The main theme in the Song of Hannah is God's power, which controls the destiny of humans, and I'm quoting, Yahweh kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. Yahweh makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and lifts up. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the beggar from the ash heap, to set them among princes and makes them inherit the throne of glory. End of quote. This is the fate of the heroes about whom the book of Samuel tells, the houses of Eli, Samuel, Saul, and David. And this is also the main content of David's song of praise at the end of the book, in which he thanks God for helping him in his most difficult moments. Thus, the Song of Hannah ends with a wish, I'm quoting, he will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed. End of quote. And David's song ends with the statement, I'm quoting, he gives his king great victories. He show unfailing kindness to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. End of quote. Notably, the book's framework also places the human at the center, not the divine. The heroes in the book are described as human beings with advantages and disadvantages, ambitions and wants. A great importance is placed on lives of the heroes and their families, and their moral resolve is critical no less than their actions. Furthermore, there are no descriptions of the direct involvement of God during the events and in people's lives, and there is no emphasis in the book on war against foreign cult and idols. The book also contains rich and complex stories with plenty of characters and secondary characters, an intricate chain of events which include sub-storylines, sophisticated dialogues, and long monologues. The narrative nature of the book distinguishes it from Joshua, most of which is made up of lists, Judges, which is a cycling and circular, and Kings, which is formulaic. The heroes that the book of Samuel deals with are Eli, Samuel, Saul, and David. The first two are religious leaders and are also presented as the last of judges. The last two are the first of the leaders who dealt with policy, military, and administration, and are presented as the first of the kings. This is the main essence of the book of Samuel, which describes the transition from the rule of the judges to the monarchy and presents the stories of the last two judges and the first two kings. In this respect, the book of Samuel is another link in the chain of the Deuteronomistic composition. On the one hand, the weakness of the judges' regime and the need for a new form of governance are clear. And on the other hand, the beginning of the monarchy raises fundamental questions and problems, such as the rights of the king and the limits of his rule. Another topic that preoccupied the book of Samuel is the exchange of power between generations of leaders. Eli and Samuel, Samuel and Saul, Saul and David. All these leaders had sons who could have succeeded them, but the power passed to the young leader who was educated and raised by the veteran leaders. The fate of the leaders is determined by a concept of reward and punishment, corruption, cultic sins, and moral sins. The theme of inheriting David's throne continues as a thread from here to the opening of the book of Kings. The speeches placed at the key points in the book of Samuel are of great importance, not only in the separation they create between the various parts of the book, but also for the purpose of understanding the goals of the editing and the positions of the editors, and for the purpose of understanding the historiographical and historiosophical questions that preoccupy them. In comparing the first speech in 1 Samuel 12, which warns against the monarchic establishment, to the second speech in 2 Samuel 7, which expresses the idea of God's eternal promise to the house of David and the connection between the royal house and the temple in Jerusalem, it is clear that the book of Samuel underwent at least two different edits, very far apart in time from each other, but which engage in dialogue with each other. Unlike the books of Joshua, Judges, and Kings, in the book of Samuel, the Deuteronomistic editing is much less prominent, and although there is a clear evidence of Deuteronomistic intervention, in Samuel there is very little room for ideology related to the laws of Deuteronomy or to the cult in Jerusalem. This editing likely included the arrangement and organization of the ancient sources and it added to the book the speeches and the verses that link between the various sources. But a late editing layer presented itself in the book of Samuel, apparently from the post-exilic period, when Judah no longer had kings from the house of David, and the rule of kings was no longer taken for granted, although it was an essential part of the nation's history. This layer is apparently the source for the special critical perspective of the book of Samuel on the monarchy in Israel, a perspective that Yair Amit, one of my teachers, defined well as an examination of the monarchy in the laboratory of history. Unlike the customary view in the ancient Near East, which sees the king as related to the gods and even as part of the order of creation, the approach developed in the book of Samuel is that the monarchy is a relatively late phenomenon in the history of the nation, is not necessary, and is not an integral part of the existence of the people. The book even develops the notion that the monarchy can be perceived as a default option that is correct for specific periods, which are not necessarily the greatest periods in the nation's history. The great leaders of the people, like Moses and Joshua, were not kings, and following them, the judges were chosen for specific task of salvation and had saved the people for long periods. Moreover, sharp criticism is expressed in every case where the power passed to a leader's son, from Abimelech, son of Gideon, to Yoel and Aviah, sons of Samuel. This ambivalent attitude towards the monarchy emphasizes, on the one hand, the lofty position of the king, who was chosen by God and is his Messiah. We can read it, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 1, chapter 26, verse 9. The king blessed with God's wisdom to lead his people and judge righteously, like in 2 Samuel 8, verse 15, or chapter 14, verse 20. And the king played a key role in cult as the one who built the temple and continues to manage it and take care of it. On the other hand, the king is presented as a person. Flaws in the monarchy as an institution and the kings themselves are noted, and the supremacy of God is stressed. Thus, for example, the failure of kings is clearly revealed as Saul's sins and is punished by having the kingship taken from him, like described in 1 Samuel 15, verses 24 to 26. David sins in adultery, in murder, and by taking the murdered man's wife as his own, and is subsequently punished by having the sword never depart from his house, as we can read in 2 Samuel 12, verse 10. And the rebellion and agitations and stirred among the people against the kings are well emphasized regarding the days of both Saul and David. Against the background of a hesitant attitude towards the monarchy, the book of Samuel emphasizes the role and status of the prophet as the mediator between the king and God. And in many cases, the character of the prophet is shaped as one who is above the king. The prophet is the one who rules over kings and can remove them from the throne. Thus, for example, Samuel anoints Saul as a king in 1 Samuel 9 to 11, but also reprimands him and informs him of the throne being revoked from his house, as we can read in chapter 13, verses 13 and 14. Samuel is also the one who anoints David as a king, but then punishes and reprimands him. Yet, the prophet is also presented in the book of Samuel as a human being. The most beautiful expression for this is found in 1 Samuel 16. When Samuel was sent to anoint David as a king, he saw Eliab, David's brother, and I'm quoting, and thought, surely Yahweh's anointed is before him. God reprimands him in verse 7 and say, but Yahweh said to Samuel, Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For Yahweh sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but Yahweh's look on the heart. Given the Deuteronomistic and post-Deuteronomistic layer of editing, one must ask if the book of Samuel also contains pre-Deuteronomistic sources, and if so, through which processes were these sources formed? Were there sources that were edited and compiled even before the Deuteronomistic editing? Were these several separate sources stories? Or in general, from which era were these sources? Why were they written and where were they created? Already in 1926, Leonard Rost's theory was presented, according to which the book of Samuel contains separate stories which were kept in the royal court in Jerusalem, including the story of the ark in 1 Samuel 5:6 and 2 Samuel 6, the stories of David's wars with the neighboring kingdoms in 2 Samuel 8 to 10, and the story of David's succession to the throne in 2 Samuel 11 to 20 and 1 Kings 1 and 2. Researchers have also proposed to add to these the story of David's ascension to the throne in 1 Samuel 16 to 2 Samuel 5, the complexity of the stories, their narrative's nature, and the emphasis on the flaws of all the heroes who appear in them prevent them from being defined as official historiographical sources. Therefore, scholars have proposed to define them as novellas. At their core lies the fantastic story of David, the resourceful boy who ascended from the social fringes to the throne. A story whose main point is the need to justify the rule of the house of David over the rule of the house of Saul. The rest of the novellas consists of various stories about kings and heroes, tales of heroism, which, among other things, were also intended to explain and clarify the orders of government and monarchy in Judah, tales that developed over time and were put into writing at a later stage. Hence, scholars hypothesize that the book of Samuel is a complex amalgamation of different sources and traditions that were collected, compiled, and edited together. Some of these sources seem very ancient and reflect a reality of the beginning of the Iron Age which no longer existed and was not recognized in the days of the Deuteronomistic editing process of the book, hundreds of years later, towards the end of the First Temple period. These sources are familiar with a political reality that didn't exist in the final days of the monarchy, like, for example, the existence of Aramaic kingdoms of Tzova and Maacha, or the existence of the kingdom of Gat that was already destroyed in the 9th century BCE, etc. In these sources, evidence of ancient religious customs is preserved, such as the direct questioning of God or the use of the ephod for getting answers from God. They are familiar with the existence of outlaws band like the Shasu and Apiru that didn't exist anymore towards the end of the First Temple period, and there are stories that are not at all flattering to David. These sources are not uniform. They seem to be a collection of folk traditions and stories which are not necessarily of the same era and seem to not have been formed into complete sections before they were collected, expanded, and edited by the Deuteronomists who integrated them within their historiographical system. The Deuteronomistic editing of the book is not very intensive and apparently included an editing of the ancient sources, which were compiled and combined through a few speeches and connecting verses centered on the speech in 2 Samuel 7, which expressed God's eternal promise to the house of David. However, the editing of the book spanned a longer time, even and perhaps mainly after the first Deuteronomistic editing, towards the end of the First Temple period, mainly during the exilic and post-exilic periods. Apparently, the book of Samuel aroused great interest and attracted theologians and scribes in different periods who repeatedly tried to adapt its messages to the need of their time. The 5 chapters in 1 Samuel 8 to 12 collect stories and traditions about the establishment of the monarchy in Israel, and the structure of this literary unit is tight and well edited, as many researchers have noted. These chapters are structured as a rondo, in which 3 assemblies of the people are described, with 2 stories placed between them. The assembly of the people at Ramah and their demand of Samuel for a king, this is in chapter 8, verses 4 to 22. The story of the search for the ashes on Saul's anointment, this is in chapter 9, verse 1 to chapter 10, verse 16. The assembly of the people at Mitzpah and the choosing of Saul comes at chapter 10, verses 17 to 27. The story of the war in Yavesh Gilad, this is in chapter 11, verses 1 to 13. And there's finally the assembly of the people in Gilgal and the restoration of the monarchy comes at chapter 11, verse 14 to chapter 12, verse 25. The stories in this unit are very sympathetic to Saul, each in its own way. In the assemblies, there are discussions, debates, and questioning of the importance and necessity of the monarchy, but none have anti-Saul undertones, so these chapters can be seen as a pro-Saul literary unit. Despite this clear structure, the tight editing and the literary sequence, since Julius Wellhausen's influential book, published already in 1887, scholars accept a separation between 2 main layers within these 5 chapters, 1 Samuel 8 to 12, to which chapter 13 and chapter 14 can be added. The assumption is that the 3 assemblies belong to a later layer, while the stories belong to the early sequence. This is assumed despite the clear understanding that even these stories have been intensively edited, and that later editing and linking verses were added to them, intended to help integrate them into the overall array, so that it is difficult to distinguish between the original and the editorial layers. This description of the 3 assemblies and the 2 stories between them is intended to present the history of the monarchy's growth in Israel. Obviously, the hand of the editor is evident in this presentation, as are the approaches of the monarchists and their detractors. Thus, the question is, what information is historical within this description? An examination of the stories reveals many difficulties within them, the first of which is actually the choice of an unknown person who stands out only because of his height, and nothing is known about his abilities. After all, the establishment of the monarchy brought dramatic changes in all areas of life in the hill country. Throughout the entire ancient Near East, this was a decisive economic, social, and political process, and all the kings in the ancient world were those who demonstrated leadership ability, were supported by influential crowds, and were considered to have received God's grace even before their reign. King David's, Jeroboam, Baasha, Omri, and Yehu all founded new dynasties are also described similarly, and even the judges were accepted as leaders only after they proved their ability. Saul, on the other hand, ascends to the throne at a time when the Philistines rule the hill country, and he is the one who was supposed to establish the frameworks of government and monarchy. However, given the historiographic viewpoint of the authors, and certainly of the editors of the book of Samuel, according to which all the history is controlled and directed by God, who is also the one who directed the establishment of the monarchy in Israel, the central story is that of Saul being chosen by Samuel, God's messenger. Saul's skills can only be revealed later. According to the logic of the story, the war in Yavesh Gilad proves the correctness of the choice, and only later can Saul realize the destiny of this choice and free Israel from the yoke of the Philistines. As a continuation of this logic, we can see how Saul loses his kingdom because he disobeyed Samuel's instructions, and how the throne was transferred to David. Another difficulty with the stories about Saul's ascension to the throne is that throughout the ancient Near East, kingship is both the end of one long social, political, and economic process and the beginning of another equally long social, political, and economic process. There is no evidence of this from the hill country of the land of Israel in this period, and the establishment of the monarchy in Israel is described as a purely political change. The reason for this is historiographical. The people of Israel had been described as a united nation since their wandering in the desert and throughout history. Therefore, the authors of the story and the editors of the book of Samuel had no choice but to describe the establishment of the monarchy as a change in the ruling system, while the social frameworks and the territorial extent of Israel continued to exist unchanged just as before. Despite all of these difficulties, many scholars agree that the war in Yavesh Gilad, as described in 1 Samuel 11, is the core of the story and the event that led to the consolidation of Saul's leadership. This story is linked to the people's assembly at Mitzpah and the choosing of Saul through the 2.5 verses that end chapter 10, verses 25 to 27, the meaning of which is not clear. I'm quoting. Then Samuel told the people the rights and duties of the kingship, and he wrote them in a book and laid it up before Yahweh. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house. Saul also went to his home at Gibeah, and there went with him the host whose hearts God had touched. But some worthless fellows said, "How can this man save us?" And they despised him and brought him no present. But he held his peace. Chapter 11 continues from the story of the war in Yavesh Gilead, opening with the words, "Then Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Yavesh Gilead." There does not seem to be a connection between the unclear ending of chapter 10, in Hebrew, Vayahi kemacharish, but he held his peace, and the opening of chapter 11, in Hebrew, Vaya'al Nahash Ammoni, then Nahash the Ammonite went up. There is also ambiguity as to the source of the description of these events, as Flavius Josephus relayed them in his The Antiquities of the Jews, since it parallels the biblical description in many details but differs from it in one key detail. Josephus' description is the same as the ending of the story described in 1 Samuel 10, and I'm quoting from Josephus. Saul also went away to Gibeah, where he was born, and many good men there were who paid him the respect that was due to him, but the greater part was ill men who despised him and derided the others, who neither did bring him presents, nor did they in affection or even in words regard to please him. End of quote. However, in Josephus' description, instead of the last words of the story of Saul's anointing as a king, Vayehi kemacharish, but he held his peace, which caused the disconnection between the end of the story and the opening of chapter 11, these closing words are replaced by words that are related to the story of chapter 11 and open it. Josephus replaced "but he held his peace," which we know from the biblical description, with the words "after 1 month," and goes on to say that after 1 month, the war with Saul had with Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, obtained him respect from all the people, as in the beginning of chapter 11. In the early 1980s, a more extended opening to the story in the book of Samuel was found in one of Qumran's scrolls. This scroll added an entire section that is not found in any known Hebrew version of the book of Samuel. It also connects the end of chapter 10 with the beginning of chapter 11 in the Hebrew Bible, thus solving the question of the text on the basis of which Josephus wrote his description in his book Antiquities. In the section of the Qumran scroll that opens with the final words of chapter 10, it is written that, "And they despised him and brought him no present." The section continues with a long sentence which is not known from any other biblical source. I'm quoting. "And Nahash, king of the Ammonites, sorely oppressed the Gadites and the Reubenites, and he gouged out all the right eyes and struck terror and dread in Israel. There was not left one among the Israelites in Transjordan whose right eye was not gouged out by Nahash, king of the Ammonites. Only 7,000 men fled from the Ammonites and entered Yavesh Gilead. About a month later, Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Yavesh Gilead, and all the men of Yavesh Gilead said to Nahash the Ammonite, 'Make with us a covenant, and we shall become your subjects.' Nahash the Ammonite said to them, 'On this condition will I make a covenant with you,'" and this is the end of the Qumran scroll. The main importance of this new Qumran section is that it preserves an entire verse that is not found in the Hebrew Bible, and this omission creates the connection and narrative continuity between chapter 10 and chapter 11. The words "Vayehi kemacharish," but he held his peace, are replaced with "Vayehi kemo chodesh," about a month later, and from there the text continues with a parallel to chapter 11. After a month, Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Yavesh Gilead. In an article published in 1980, Frank Moore Crost claimed that, from linguistic perspective, a literary perspective, and above all, in terms of narrative logic, the Qumran scroll text preserves the original wording, which was omitted from the biblical text in the process of its copying. This wording also explains well the interrupt passage in the Masoretic text between chapter 10 and chapter 11, as well as the reason for the war with the Ammonites and the Yavesh Gilead's role in this story, due to the shelter they gave to the 7,000 people who escaped from the enslavement areas of Nahash, king of the Ammonites. Moreover, the change and the copying error of words "Vayehi kemo chodesh," about a month later, to "Vayehi kemacharish," but he held his peace, is clarified here. And finally, this text also explains and is consistent with the text in the Septuagint translation and in Josephus' book, The Antiquities of the Jews. Although not all scholars accept Cross' opinion, I find his explanation for the text from Qumran scroll convincing. This enables us to reconstruct the rise of Saul as a savior judge. Quite likely, his victory over the Ammonites was the first step in the process of his ascension to the throne. Up to this point, there has been no hint of Philistine enslavement. We can assume that the action against the Philistines relates to the later phase in the days of Saul. Proof that in the early biblical texts, before the omission preserved in the Qumran scroll, the incident of Yavesh Gilead was mentioned as the main motive for Saul's reign can be found in Samuel's speech in chapter 12. According to verse 12, the direct reason for the people's request for a king is the war in Yavesh Gilead, and I'm quoting. And when you saw that Nahash the king of the Ammonites came against you, you said to me, said Saul, no, but a king shall reign over us, when Yahweh, your God, was your king. End of quote. This chapter reveals the extent to which the information we have from the biblical descriptions is based on the interpretation of the existing text and was subjected during the hundred of years of repeated copying on a parchment scrolls to omissions, changes, intentional or unintentional, edits, and additions. This process continued since the creation of the book of Samuel in its original form, somewhere at the end of the First Temple period, through its editing in the post-exilic area, sometimes during the Persian period, and at least until after the destruction of the Second Temple. At that time, the ancient text underwent a process of canonization during which the biblical text was formulated and editing. The books that would be included in the canon were determined, and verses and words were counted. From this time onwards, the biblical text seemed to have been more or less set. The finding of the scroll in Qumran offered a small peek into the processes that the biblical text underwent, and it allows us to reconstruct the reason why Saul went to war with the Ammonites, just like the judges who also emerged to save the people in times of trouble. But for Saul, this war and the great success in his victory over Nahash the Ammonite was only the beginning of his path to establishing his rule and the beginning of his reign. In the next chapter, we will move from the book of Samuel to the book of Kings, and following that, from Saul to the first kings of the historical kingdom of Israel. After an introduction to the book of Kings, we'll try to understand what is written in this book about the history of the kings of Israel and Judah, what the Deuteronomistic historiographers knew about the first kings that ruled in the kingdom of Israel, and what did they know about the greatness and power of the mighty kings from the Omride dynasty, what they didn't know about the Omrides, and how these things correspond to the story that was told about them and to that which was left untold. See you in the next chapter.